Dr. Clay, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Council, guests, and friends, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the first program of our 1983-84 year. All of us at the Council have been delighted with our past programs and deeply appreciative to our numerous guests. And I think our first program this evening is perfectly in keeping with our past tradition. The subject for tonight is Central America, of course, and our guest is Dr. Fred C. Clay, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Before we begin our introduction, I'd like to thank the Westinghouse Corporation for this evening's reception. We'd also like to thank our good friends from the World Trade Center Institute. And I'd like to remind you all that on the 21st of September, our next guest will be Sir Oliver Wright, the Ambassador from Great Britain to the United States. That program will be at the Hyatt Regency. Dinner will precede the address, but dinner is optional. You can come to both dinner and the address, or simply to the address. But please make your reservations as soon as possible. Dr. E. Clay is a graduate of the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago, holding a PhD received in 1950. He has been a member of the Bureau of Applied Social Research at Columbia. He served with the RAND Corporation. He's been associated with the Center for International Studies at Harvard. He has been a professor at MIT. He returned in 1968 to the RAND Corporation to head the Social Studies Department. In 1973, he was appointed as director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency by President Nixon. He served in that position through the Ford administration. From 1977 to 1981, he held numerous directorships at both private foundations and private corporations. He also served as the chairman of the Republican National Committee's advisory group on national security affairs. He also headed up the foreign policy advisors for President Reagan from 1979 to 1980. He was appointed to his present position in 1981. He has combined then the career of the scholar with that of the statesman. The subject tonight, of course, is Central America. Questions which are of immediate significance and long-term significance are well known to all of us. The issues we'll discuss tonight, of course, will be with us for many decades. Hopefully not in a particular form, but probably indeed as matters of principle and the nature of the international arena. We're indeed fortunate to have say among the scholar and the statesman who seriously attended to the questions which we'll be addressing. His remarks tonight are underlined by the news reports which you've read, I'm sure, both in the New York Times and the Sun papers. That this address this evening is considered to be a significant statement of the Reagan position at the present time on Central America. It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome to the Council Dr. Fred C. Clay.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction. I'm indeed delighted to be here with you and to have an opportunity to talk to you all. Central America is closer to Baltimore than is California, in terms of geographic distance, that is. But the intellectual distance between here and Central America is enormous. Most Americans are not well informed about Central America. Many are misinformed, and some are outright disdainful about the cultural and social importance of this region. You all have an obligation to remedy this situation so that you and your representatives in Congress can engage in constructive support or constructive criticism of the administration's policy. To begin with, you should know that the President's policy for Central America has not yet been given a chance to work. The blocking votes in Congress have denied the President the means to succeed. Indeed, Members of Congress have involved themselves in the management of U.S. policy for Central America more than for any other region of the world. While Congress has quickly and easily approved some $4.5 billion in security assistance for nations in the Mediterranean region, it slashed nearly in half the much smaller allocation for nations in the Caribbean region, so much closer to home. While Congress has been generally supportive of the deployment of some 1,200 U.S. Marines to Lebanon, it fought fiercely to limit the number of U.S. trainers in El Salvador to 55. While Congress has not objected to large military exercises in the faraway Indian Ocean region, many members have heavily criticized the recent military exercises in the nearby Caribbean region. While Congress has for a long time supported Radio Free Europe, that fine radio program that brings the truth to the people of Eastern Europe, some members of Congress have delayed for 2 years President Reagan's request for a new radio station that would bring the truth to the people in Cuba. As we consult with members of Congress on these issues, we are often told that you, their constituents, are pressing such positions on them. But as we review the public opinion polls, we discover an extraordinary lack of information. For example, in a recent New York Times CBS poll, only 8% of the respondents knew, both for El Salvador and Nicaragua, whether the U.S. was supporting the government or the insurgents. You must help overcome not only a lack of information, but also a great deal of misinformation. This misinformation is not accidental. It is the result of a well-organized and well-orchestrated effort. The fabric of fiction has been tightly woven to conceal the essential facts. Let me review with you some of these fictions. Fiction has it that U.S. influence in Central America and Latin America has prevented democratic development, that the spread of Leninist regimes is a tide of history, a natural process of social reform we should not oppose. The fact is that the trend toward democratization has continued. Among the 32 independent states of Latin America and the Caribbean, 17 are now democratic. Since 1978, 5 countries have made a peaceful transition from military regimes to elected democratic governments. It is the much criticized military regimes that are often transformed into a democracy. But there has never yet been a Marxist-Leninist regime that was succeeded by democracy. Another bit of fiction, that the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua would have developed into a pluralistic democracy had it not been for U.S. intervention. The fact is that the Sandinistas, only a few weeks after they came into power, reneged on their promise for early elections, began to attack the democratic trade unions, and invited Cuban military and security personnel in steadily growing numbers. Yet, during the first 18 months of the Sandinista regime, the United States provided more than $120 million in direct aid and over $220 million in Inter-American Development Bank aid, more than the previous Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua had received from the United States in 20 years. Clearly, it was not U.S. interference that drove the Sandinistas to link up with Fidel Castro, unless economic aid is regarded as interference. Another piece of fiction is the charge that the Reagan administration is militarizing the province of Central America and is bringing the East-West conflict to the region. Well, the East is already there. The Soviets are giving 10 times 10 times as much military assistance to Cuba and Nicaragua as we are providing to all of Latin America. And Soviet military advisors in Cuba and Nicaragua outnumber U.S. military advisors in the Caribbean region 20 to 1. Since Congress is so deeply involved in our day-to-day policy toward Central America, our key objectives need to be clear to the American people. Moreover, Congress must share with the administration an understanding of our basic strategy. On one thing we can all agree. We do not want the United States to fail. We must succeed. But what is it we would like to see happen, and what do we want to prevent? We have wide agreement, I believe, that the United States favors the continuation of and strengthening of the trend toward open, genuine democracy. And we favor social and economic betterment for the people in Central America, a region so close to us. Equally important is what we want to prevent. We want to prevent the expansion of totalitarian regimes, particularly Leninist ones, since they will import Stalinist police systems, bring in Soviet arms, and even invite Soviet military bases. There are two more reasons why Leninist regimes are particularly dangerous. Once entrenched, they tend to become irreversible, and they usually seek to export their totalitarianism to other nations. Given these objectives, what should be our strategy? First, we want to help build the road toward democracy and economic development. In the end, the people in each country will have to make their own choices. They can succeed only through their own dedicated effort. But we can help through advice, influence, by facilitating trade, and by giving aid. The Caribbean Basin Initiative of the Reagan administration, to which Congress has now agreed, is right on target. So are our efforts in El Salvador in behalf of elections and for improvements in the judicial system. Also, we are using diplomacy to help the government of El Salvador win over those who are willing to abandon violence and compete in elections, provided they can be assured of safe and fair participation. But we must not underestimate our adversaries. The hardcore among the insurgents will never settle for a fair democratic process. We can no more negotiate an acceptable political solution with these people than the Social Democrats in revolutionary Russia could have talked Lenin into giving up Bolshevism. Second, this leads to the next second requirement of our strategy. Secretary Schultz recently explained the guerrillas in El Salvador have used a rule or ruin strategy. They seek to destroy economic assets faster than we can restore them. You cannot have economic development in a nation if guerrilla forces keep blowing up bridges, power lines, school buildings, buses. You have to defeat these rule or ruin forces militarily. This is the purpose of our military assistance. Every so often, the critics of the Reagan administration proclaim with an accusatory connotation that we seek a military solution in El Salvador. If a military solution means putting primary emphasis on military assistance and military means, then it is more factual to accuse the Reagan administration of seeking an economic solution, since $3 out of 4 in the requested assistance programs are for economic aid. What we seek to do is to open the doors to democracy and close the doors to violence. But we have to use military means against those who insist till they have imposed their rule on using violence. Let me make this clear to you. We do not seek a military defeat for our friends. We do not seek a military stalemate. We seek victory for the forces of democracy, and that victory has two components. One, defeating militarily those organized forces of violence that refuse to accept the democratic will of the people. Two, establishing an adequate internal system for justice and personal security. At this point, let us recall our first agreed principle that we do not want the United States to fail. Hence, we must allocate sufficient means so that we can succeed. And as long as the group in Congress keeps crippling the President's military assistance program, we will have a policy always shy of success. We will remain locked into a protracted failure. This, the American people should not tolerate. If we are merely involved to fail, then we should not be involved at all. The resources needed to succeed are small compared to our investment for security in other regions of the world. Once Congress gives us the means to succeed, the capability and determination of the United States will become clear. This will make the Soviet Union more cautious, which in turn will help our success. On the other hand, if we signal that we are afraid of victory over the forces of violence, if we signal that we have opted for protracted failure, we will only encourage the Soviets to redouble their effort. We will be inviting ever-increasing difficulties. Now, the third requirement for our strategy. This third requirement for U.S. strategy in Central America is least well understood. We should seek to prevent the partition of Central America, a division of this region into two spheres, one linked to the Soviet bloc and one linked to the United States. Such a partition would inexorably lead to a hostile confrontation of large military forces, a confrontation that could last for decades. We can see how such a confrontation works as we look at Cuba. During the 24 years of the Castro dictatorship, while the standard of living deteriorated and human rights were widely violated, Cuba built up a large military establishment. It has the second largest army in Latin America, second only to Brazil. It has some 200 Make fighter aircraft, submarines, 8,000 to 10,000 Soviet advisors, and several Soviet intelligence installations. In addition, Castro has sent some 30 to 40,000 troops abroad to provide the mercenary forces to protect Soviet imperial outposts. As a result of this militarization of Cuba, our sea lanes to NATO are now seriously threatened. The Sandinista regime in Nicaragua is determined to create a second Cuba in Central America. Ever since they seized power, the Sandinistas embarked on a major military buildup. Today, they have a much larger army than that dictator Somoza ever had. And they have expressed the intention to build the largest force in Central America. Nicaragua is building military airfields, is importing Soviet tanks, Soviet helicopters, armored vehicles, and other equipment. This second Cuba in Nicaragua would be more dangerous than Castro's Cuba, since it shares hard-to-defend borders with Honduras and Costa Rica. The Sandinistas have already started terrorist activities in both these countries. And in addition, of course, Nicaragua provides essential support for the insurgency in El Salvador. Even after the insurgency in El Salvador has been brought under control, Nicaragua, if it continued on its present course, would be the bridgehead and arsenal for insurgency for Central America. And once the Sandinistas have acquired the military strength that they have long been planning for, they might well use that strength for direct attacks on their neighbors to help speed up, as they call it, the revolution without frontiers that they promised us. At that time, the only way to help protect the democracies might be for the United States to place forward deployed forces in these countries, as we now do in Korea and West Germany. Clearly, we must prevent such a partition of Central America. In the Democratic Party's response to President Reagan's April 27 address on Central America to the joint session of Congress, Senator Dodd said, quote, "We will oppose the establishment of Marxist states in Central America," end of quote. Yet, a majority in the House of Representatives has done exactly the opposite. It voted to oppose U.S. assistance to those who oppose the establishment of a Marxist state in Nicaragua. That is to say, a blocking majority in the House, in effect, voted to establish a sanctuary for the Sandinistas. Congressional legislation to deny U.S. support to the democratic resistance forces in Nicaragua would turn Nicaragua into a sanctuary for which the nations of Central America could be safely attacked, but in which U.S.-supported forces could not operate. This would enable the promoters of totalitarianism, while being supplied and replenished by Cuba and the Soviet Union, to attack neighboring countries indefinitely and always with impunity. Hence, it would deprive the Marxist groups in El Salvador of any incentive to compromise. Indeed, if such legislation were passed, the Sandinistas and Cubans might well find it safe to increase their assistance to the insurgents in El Salvador, or to step up the destabilization in Honduras and Costa Rica. This, after all, would be fully consistent with their presently declared objectives, and the guaranteed sanctuary would render such escalation almost risk-free. The psychological impact from cutting off U.S. assistance to the Nicaraguan resistance forces fighting for democracy in their native land would be severe. Such a cutoff would signal throughout the region that the totalitarian Leninist forces represent the winning side. The democratic forces would have cause to despair. They would see that the terrorist and insurgent attacks against them are being generously supported by Cuba and the Soviet bloc, and that these attacks could be conducted from safe havens that would be protected by the U.S. Congress, in effect, from all counter-interference. Conversely, the totalitarian Leninist forces would know that as soon as they seize control of the country, they will be secure. Cuba and the Soviet bloc will help them maintain an efficient police machinery to repress the people, and should any group arise to fight for freedom, the United States Congress would have denied all support. Let me recapitulate. Our basic objectives for Central America are clear. We want to strengthen democracy. We want to prevent, in this hemisphere, the expansion of totalitarian regimes, especially those linked to the Soviet Union. To this end, we extend economic support and promote democratic development. But given forces of violence that will not accept the democratic will of the people, we also have to provide military assistance, enough to succeed. In addition, we must prevent consolidation of a Sandinista regime in Nicaragua that would become an arsenal for insurgency, a safe haven for the export of violence. If we cannot prevent that, we have to anticipate the partition of Central America. Such a development would then force us to man a new military front line of the East-West conflict right here on our continent. To prevent such an outcome, the administration and Congress must work together with a strategy that can succeed. Thank you very much.
Dr. Clay, certainly thanks for when we feel privileged to have that particular articulation presented before this council. Thank you very much. Dr. Clay, of course, is agreed to answer questions until our stopping time, which is 10 minutes after 7.
Dr. O'Kay, you began your talk by referring to the lack of knowledge of so many of our American citizens about the actual situation of America. I'm not at all persuaded that the representatives of Congress are reflecting the views of some citizens. Some of us don't quite see it as a simple democratic versus communism, we against them civilization. We feel perhaps a little more complex than that. And the question is it fair to assume that many of the countries in the area are at least as well informed about the economic, social, political conditions down there as our own State Department? And given that assumption, is our knowledge and our judgment so far superior that we're superimposing our judgments and our decisions over what may be recommended by this combination of states and
The situation is very complex, and the friends whom we are supporting to help them to carry out their social democratic revolutions, as the one that started in El Salvador that we are supporting with its land reform, or the friends that we are supporting to improve their justice systems or their health systems, have against the standards that we may apply, not necessarily to ourselves, but to others, many failings. The criminal justice system in this country, of course, has certain defects, and there are criminals who don't get apprehended, or the justice system doesn't catch up with them. But the failings in these countries, so close to warfare and poverty, are, unsurprisingly, often more severe. You're so right. The people right in the countries and governments right in the region have a closer understanding, have similar situations, and this to them that we listen. There's the government of Honduras, the government of Nicaragua, of Costa Rica, one of the oldest democracies in the region, the government of Venezuela, the government of Mexico. All these countries we're in constant contact with. We visit. We have groups formed to negotiate a reduction in the violence and to facilitate, for those who want to participate in the democratic process, the act of doing so.
Yes.
You said at one point that that there was no nation that had gone Marxist-Leninist that had ever been reversed, that process had been reversed. But wasn't in the mid-60s in Indonesia, wasn't there a trend towards communist rule that was reversed?
There was an attempted takeover by the Communist Party, which got stopped at the last minute, 1 minute to midnight, and then there came a very severe repression of the entire Communist Party, but the Communist Party failed to take over the government. So this rule has no exception.
Yes.
I'd like to ask about a phrase used as guaranteed sanctuary. You've said that those who won't in the Congress support anti-government guerrillas in countries that are ruled by Marxist-Leninists are in effect supporting or providing a guaranteed sanctuary to these people. Is it not also possible to argue that refusing to support anti-government guerrillas is refusing to compromise respect for the principle of sovereignty, that one does not, in fact, support insurrectionary forces against governments?
Right. You have to have the priorities here very much in mind. The first priority is the integrity of established nations, and the right to self-defense follows. Now, these nations, some which are linked with us, like El Salvador, have to defend themselves against aggression an insurgency planted in their country from a neighboring country, Nicaragua. Their right of self-defense under the United Nations Charter and the US Charter permits a response. That's been like this all the time. Otherwise, you could not defend yourself if the aggressor had the freedom to operate out of his country, to mount strikes against another country, but he was guaranteed there would be no response. Now, you're correct. The interference, the counter-interference, whatever we call it, the response, has to follow, it should only follow, the acts of aggression.
I get the impression from your presentation that your concern is not so much about the people in these various countries, but whether our position vis-a-vis the Soviet regime would be affected. Is that correct?
It's not correct. It's both that we, in my view, ought to be concerned about. The people in the area, because we're close to them, there are many, many links into our social fabric and our cultural fabric. And as a general rule, this country has long taken an interest in the economic and political improvement of other countries. And some of the successes we can be proud of. We helped establish democracy in the Federal Republic of Germany and Japan. We shouldn't be ashamed of that. That we can help democracy to take roots elsewhere. It is, I think, both in our moral and in our national interest. But second, the other concern applies as well. To have Soviet military bases encroach further, to have Soviet military hardware being readily supplied to one country in Central America so you can attack other countries, is against our national security interests.
Sir, I'm confused as much as an awful lot of American citizens on whose side we are on. But if I remember correctly, Somoza was a friend of the United States, and I think that he was in this country, got a lot of his military training. Why did we abandon Somoza in Nicaragua and cause this condition that is there now?
Yes, we did abandon Somoza. We discontinued all military assistance. We advised other countries that were giving, friendly countries that were giving some military assistance, to stop military assistance to Somoza, so as to facilitate what we thought would be a social, legitimate social revolutionary government to replace the dictatorship. A dictatorship to which, remember, as I mentioned, we gave less economic assistance than we had given to the Somozistas, to the Sandinistas in their first 18 months. During the entire 20 years, we helped Somoza less. And the Sandinistas then were recognized before they had the government in Managua, which has a bearing on your question too. They were recognized by the Organization of American States in exchange for a promise that they would hold prompt elections. So that government, that group, rather, the Sandinistas, got support from the outside, not just from Cuba, generously, in the Soviet Union, but even from us, before they had control of the central government in Managua. At that time, there was little criticism about interfering in internal affairs of Nicaragua when we did that. Curious.
Dr. Clay, I appreciate your comments. Unfortunately, I find some of them disturbing. In fact, I find many of them disturbing. I have two particular questions I'd like to ask. There have been gross violations of human rights, as we know, in the revolutionary situation which exists, particularly in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras. I'd like to know why the Reagan administration hasn't pressed harder for one symbolic situation, which is the murders of 4 women in December, as to a satisfactory resolution of that in the El Salvadoran courts. That's one question. The second question is, you continually refer to enough to succeed in terms of military assistance in Central America. To that, I must admit, must be El Salvador and the Somocistas in Nicaragua. What does enough to succeed mean in your view, and does that mean the Reagan administration is going to be trying to press for an overall resolution in terms of military assistance to that region?
Let me take the second question first and then go to the first question. Enough to succeed is to enable the elected government of El Salvador to equip their armed forces so that they now hardly have enough medical equipment to help their soldiers from dying of wounds that they wouldn't have to die of. That's medical support. To have ammunition to defend themselves. We're not supporting Somozistas. Somoza was killed and the Somozistas are gone. The question on human rights, that's a very, very important question. And there are human rights violations, of course, under the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. The expulsion of the mosquitoes from their homes, the burning of their villages. They are often not mentioned in the same context. The government of Honduras has a very democratic government, elected, functioning parliament, and the human rights situation there, even by serious evaluations, is good against the standards in the region. In El Salvador, there's still a long way to go. And you're right. We have to press there, and we are doing that, to press the government of El Salvador to improve its criminal justice system so it can function, so the prosecutions can be completed of people that can be found guilty with sufficient evidence, and the cases can be closed. But remember, there's a war going on in that country. The judicial system was partially changed as a result of our influence to make the judges independent of the executive branch. Now, when we discussed with the executive branch that they should get a quicker prosecution, they say the judges are independent because it presses making so. If that had been the old situation, you could have told the judge to complete the prosecution of the cases you mentioned. Second, remember that there are many cases in the courts in New York and Chicago that drag on for years, where the general public or parts of a jury may clearly find that the parties are guilty and the system fails. That is not to condone system failure, but to put it to use standards which we also use against ourselves.
Well, I don't want to turn this into a dialogue because many people have other questions, but El Salvador is not Chicago. And there has not even been an indictment rendered against its 4 women murdered in 1980. Now, it's about time that the Reagan administration saw that there is a symbolic message in human rights to be delivered here at El Salvador. The State Department white papers, I'm sure you know, since you were part of that process undoubtedly, was roundly criticized. The Reagan administration needs to be called to task about the situation of human rights in El Salvador and the rest of the region. Those 4 women are a symbol of that, and there's been no satisfactory progress. In fact, the judges involved in that case supposedly have announced that the new evidence has occurred and the solution to or the satisfactory completion of investigation of the case itself may be delayed for as long as another year. It's 1983.
The answer is that we're not interested in just a symbolic improvement. We want a real improvement. This pushing around of symbolism, I think that diverts us from the genuine strategy in which we can all converge, and that we can all support in Congress and among the public of genuine improvement, rather than this battle of symbolic cases and symbolic solutions there too.
I'm just wondering why, because of the citizens, they set the sentiments of the big Panama, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, not governments, all about those. Because we are aware of the citizens. Why is it that you don't feel in help? I just let you know, like medical supplies for women soldiers, just don't want to act.
Why does who not act? I'm sorry.
Panama, Costa Rica, Venezuela.
Why do the other countries not help?
Yes.
Oh yes, right. Well, Costa Rica is very poor, as a country with deep economic difficulties, is a small country. Venezuela has given a lot of humanitarian help. Panama has given some help. Panama is giving help to Costa Rica. So there is assistance, and that is very fortunate and important.
Mr. Session.
Doctor, I want to make sure I'm pronouncing your name right. How do you pronounce it?
Eclay.
Eclay, thank you. Dr. Eclay, I saw a bumper sticker today on I-95 that said El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. And that leads me to my question, which is that when you talk about Congress and the House of Representatives, it seems to me that the system that we're under in the United States is that I feel that the House of Representatives is speaking for me as a citizen and as representatives in the House who share a view that is my view. And I feel that we learn from history, and that sitting with us tonight is Henry Niles, who organized 1,500 small businesses in America to go to Congress to speak against the war in Vietnam. And that there is similarities here from the standpoint that out of that experience, that the House of Representatives is saying something for me early on, at least, much earlier than Vietnam, and I think they're making an important statement. I think it's an important part of our system that we have this creative tension that exists between the House and the Senate, and that we have this kind of dialogue that's going on, and that we're not just a rubber stamp for the policies of the State Department and the Reagan administration.
I don't disagree with you at all in your statements about the useful functioning of our democratic system of our Congress, where the House or Senate separately are combined, and the interaction between those houses and any executive branch, any administration. On Vietnam, that of course is often raised as a warning, as an analogy. And like any historic analogies, you can read them backwards and forwards in different ways. Vietnam can be a warning about trying to get involved in a way that cannot succeed. Vietnam can be a warning about the human misery and the resulting flood of refugees that a communist takeover would bring with it. When the government in North Vietnam, the communist government, was established in the 50s, I believe 1 or 2 million people fled to the south. When we had all the problems, including human rights problems of the government in Saigon and Thieu, borders were open. There were no boat people. Since then, you know what happened. You know what happened in Cambodia. Now the situation in our own hemisphere would of course be different, in that people would come in much larger numbers, and probably more rapidly. So that alone would be an immense problem of humanitarian and social concern to this country, and financial concern. There are many differences with Vietnam. Vietnam is now under a brutal communist dictatorship, but it's, 7,000 miles away. As I said at the beginning, El Salvador is closer to Baltimore than is California. So there's another difference. And there's also the factor of regret. You seem to have followed the history of Vietnam quite well. I don't know whether you read such journals like the New York Review of Books or others. You may have read the confession of people in Vietnam who opposed our involvement there violently, and who now tell us they were all wrong. So there's another lesson from Vietnam.
President Reagan
recently asked if the Pentagon and the State Department would provide him with a list of the successes of the administration in foreign policy. Could you give us a balance sheet of what you see as the successes of the administration in the last 2.5 years, and perhaps